You're juggling it all: work, family, decisions, expectations, 6 hats, maybe more every single day. But behind the scenes, your body is running on stress, and stress left unchecked will lead to illness. I'm Dr. Shami, an integrated family doctor, and this is 6 Hats, the podcast that helps you understand what stress is doing to your body and what you can do about it now. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the 6 Hats podcast. Now, so many people listening to this podcast are doing all the right things: therapy, supplements, exercise, mindset work, yet still feel stuck, overwhelmed, or on edge. Now, today's guest helps us understand why. Now, Cameron Allen is a neurotechnologist and the founder of Neuroprogeny, a neuroscience-based approach that helps people learn how to regulate their nervous system in real time, rather than just manage symptoms. So his work bridges hard neuroscience with lived human experience, helping people move out of survival mode and into a state of safety, clarity, and choice. And today we're exploring what nervous system regulation really means, why it's so often missed in healthcare, and how learning to feel safe in your body can be the foundation for healing. So welcome, Cameron.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
And Cameron, we were just having a chat offline and we were just saying, wow, wish we were actually in the same location, because I would literally refer all my patients to you and
vice versa. Yep.
Which is amazing. All of my listeners know, that the whole point of this podcast is to really get the message across of how stress affects the body. And we underestimate it. Not many health practitioners really dive in. And to be honest with you, Cameron, most health practitioners are stressed and not really healthy themselves, because the medical training doesn't even talk about wellness. And I think things are changing. I'm hearing in the States, they're going to start teaching nutrition in med school, which actually sounds really crazy.
Hasn't that happened already? Not sure, but that's great that's happening.
So tiny steps in the right direction, and just being aware of what the stress does to your body is huge. And that's like the basis, the foundation of the work I do. So I'm really excited to hear your story. So I think everyone's thinking, okay, what is neuroprogeny? So for someone hearing about your work for the first time, what problem were you trying to solve when you created it?
Yeah. So my mission with Neuroprogeny goes back about 23 years ago. My brother had sustained a series of head injuries, and out of that developed a lot of depression and then into suicidal ideation. And in that whole process, just seeing all of the reactivity that was coming up and the sensory overwhelm, and just how he went from being this really grounded, connected, pretty relational guy to just everything coming at him would send him over the top, and it would just activate his entire nervous system. And there was just very little regulation. And so he attempted suicide a number of times. And in that, my folks had tried everything. They looked for all kinds of solutions for him, and eventually found a neurotherapy clinic that he went to that was able to work with a lot of the underlying damage that had occurred and help to retrain the brain and retrain the nervous system so that it increased the capacity. And it was amazing. After about 4 months, the lights just came on. He was back. He was affectionate. He was kind. He was tolerant. He was able to actually express emotion. And I remember, sitting at the dinner table. It was Thanksgiving that he had come back, and it was our first meal together. And everybody was laughing. Everybody was connecting. Everybody forgot what it was like to have so much dysregulation in the house. And we were all just there. And I was heading down a path of aeronautical engineering at the time. Decided to make a pivot into neuroscience because I realized that program that he went through was $30,000, and it was incredibly effective. And anything that's effective is fantastic, but worthless if nobody can have access to it. So we really needed to make the neuroscience more well-known. We needed to make effective tools that could be delivered anywhere so that individuals have physical access to it. And then it needed to be at a price point that individuals could afford. And so over the years have had nonprofits, and I've helped set up clinics with really the intention of reducing the cost. And then getting into, over the last 23 years, have been doing research on every brain-based intervention I could possibly
Wow.
find to see what was really working. And there's so many tools out there that have great marketing, and there's some tools that are authentically really effective, but are very, very expensive. So eventually we started Neuroprogeny, said, we've got to develop the technology. And so we've been able to actually develop the world's first standalone virtual reality biofeedback device, which is really cool because when we're in virtual reality, our eyes and our ears are experiencing a different reality, but our sensory system is not. And so our brain rapidly scans to look for, okay, what's happening in our body? Why aren't we getting this information? Which increases the connection between the brain and the body. And as we'll talk about a little bit later, that, when we experience a lot of oxidative stress, that disconnects and we're not getting an accurate message from our body. And so our brain is going through all these predictions and guessing at what's happening in our world that really amps up the stress. So if we can actually increase that while using biofeedback for people to see the internal narratives, thoughts, the stress responses in real time, it actually trains the brain to expand capacity to not buy into all of the plot lines and stories that are happening in our mind. And so it's been a really cool journey. We're along the path, but we're going to continue to improve and advance. But one of the core pieces of Neuroprogeny that I really love is not just the technology, but it's firmly rooted in an online community. And we have to have community. And getting oxytocin is really at the core of that connection and community that allows our nervous system to drop in, allows for cellular repair, allows for us to come out of that stress state. And so that was really the catalyst, was that these neuroscience and brain-based tools really needed to be accessible. And that's what we've been pursuing.
Amazing. Oh my God, I love your story about your brother. That's incredible. Because the reason why I'm saying that is sometimes people feel that's permanent and done, and then you just literally give hope for so many.
Yes. How often do we experience something, any type of symptom, whether it's the autism spectrum or it's ADD, ADHD, or even if it's coming down to I'm experiencing stress and I've got repetitive patterns in my life, and all of a sudden it's like, that's just my lot in life. This is what I've got to deal with. And no, there are so many tools that we can use in order to resource the system and be able to shift so many of those patterns.
Amazing. Now, before I go deeper into Neuroprogeny, I would love to have a conversation about why do you feel people are so stressed in today's world more than they've ever been? And I'm just curious about your opinion, and I'm going to share mine as well.
Yeah, I'd love to hear yours. Yeah. It's interesting. I was having a conversation with a number of folks that are in one of the masterminds, and we were talking about what is at the core of modern day stress. And so often there's the scapegoating that it's the social media. It is that the world has developed faster than we can actually adapt to it. That there's, even down to the hundreds of thousands of ads that we actually see a day, whether it's a logo or whether it's an actual ad, and all of these distractors that our brain has to process so much stimuli. And I think that has a lot to do with it, that we have a whole lot coming at us and that our brain is trying to figure out, okay, what's important? What do we actually need to attend to? And then I think that there's the other side of it where we are missing connection, not just connection and community, which is huge. That is a major part of it. And having the authentic, accurate mirror of who we are in a vulnerable community that is self-aware. That's a big piece of it. But we're also missing a ton of connection with ourselves. Wow. And what I mean by that is not just a sense of, trusting yourself and getting to know yourself and all of that, but quite literally when it comes down to our gut health and the fact that we are not getting all of our neurotransmitters, that are generated largely in our gut and throughout our biological system and then pumped up to the brain. We're not getting that feedback. And so our second brain is kind of offline. But then there's also some of these other pieces of our proprioceptive system, the way that we actually interpret where we are in space, all of the pressure sensors in our joints and the vestibular system that's saying, hey, here is a 3D picture of the world around you. Here is all of what's happening around you. And this is all you really need to make a decision on. And oftentimes when we actually look at, mental health or oxidative stress, it really comes down to there's a mismatch of communication through some key areas of our brain that have to do a whole lot with that we are getting an incomplete picture from our senses and from our environment. And then our brain is sitting here with an incomplete picture, having to make guesses and saying, okay, I think we're good. I'm going to test this relationship and I'm going to see, okay, are we good? And so we end up going into relationship testing. We go into dopamine seeking. We go into stimulus seeking behaviors just to try to figure out where are we in the world around us and in relationship to one another. And so because of that, it leaves a lot of room for the brain to have to just guess constantly. And every time it guesses, and I'll get a little bit technical and we'll back off, we're synthesizing dopamine around that expectation that, if something feels off in your body, we immediately create a narrative because our minds are meaning-making machines. And so we're trying to make meaning and say, okay, I'm feeling this way because so-and-so said this thing. I'm feeling this way because my kids are overactivated and so it's them. I'm feeling this way because I'm not good enough. And so we go into shame cycles, whatever it is, but we synthesize that dopamine. If that expectation doesn't come true, then that dopamine, is replaced by norepinephrine, adrenaline, cortisol, these stress chemicals that activate the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, which is just essentially, in simple terms, our fight or flight response throughout our body, which then activates our body to send a signal back to our brain that's incomplete. And we create a new loop. And that it really is oxytocin that modifies the way that dopamine cycle works. So our brain can calm down, so we can feel connected to ourselves. We can feel that deep sense of warmth and groundedness. And then we can bring that into relationship with others and have authenticity and have vulnerability. And so that's a snapshot, but I think it really comes down to the nutritional side. And then it comes down to a whole lot of when we have been in a constant oxidative stress state, we quiet down the noise that's coming from our body. And so our vagus nerve can't tell our brain we're safe. And then we're just caught in a lot of rumination and cognitive loops. And we're in this head game rather than being a full integrated human being engaging in our full experience. So long-winded way of answering it. But I'm curious what your thoughts are.
That was beautifully explained. And I'm like, yes, that was going on in my head. You've nailed it. And you're absolutely right. Where I'm going at is literally, I think people have lost their way. They've been caught up in someone else's reality. I mean, I listen to so many stories and I ask the biggest question is, what brings you joy in the week? What do you do for yourself? And it's something most of my patients just pause at because they're actually not sure. And what I've noticed, they've caught up in this to-do list, this routine that's actually not bringing them joy. It's almost like living for someone else. Well, I need to do that for my children. I need to do that for my partner. I need to do that for work. And it's actually going back to yourself and sitting in stillness of go, what's important to you? What's meaningful to you? Is this actually in line with your values? And that's something so important that, we've actually lost touch with yourself. What you said, connect with yourself. And it's almost we're living someone else's story. And it's not going back. And that's where a lot of anxiety and maybe low mood or just, they're not feeling quite right or, the stress response comes in. And this is a nice time to just pause and sort of say, what am I doing? And it's so interesting. People go on the journey, they leave jobs, they may or may not leave relationships, but they change their life to what they feel is important. And it's so true. The other side to that is we're not designed to be indoors all day. We're not designed to be blue light and not to be in nature, grounding. That's where we self-regulate. And community, you mentioned such a good point, because I've seen so many people, and I asked the question about loneliness. They could be in marriages, relationships, have a family, but still feel lonely and not connected. And I think that's one of the biggest issues in today's world, where we think we're connected, but we're actually not. And I always say to people, you're not designed to live life alone. You're not designed to solve problems alone. And that whole, we've stepped away from villages and communities that we can go and ask an elder for advice or go and ask a neighbor for help. That's gone away. And I go, no wonder we're stressed. We're trying to navigate all of this on our own. And we're so confused whether this is our pathway. But we could have a conversation about this for hours.
Absolutely. Well, I think that that piece of it, of being able to go to an elder, being able to go to a neighbor, and these days, so many people believe they should be able to do it on their own. And so there's this innate shame-based kind of thing of, if I am not able to tolerate everything coming at me, then there must be something with
Yeah.
me. And no, it's very much that our biology, our sense of self, all of our system needs that connection with nature, with elders, with community. That I love the way you said that.
Awesome. I want to go back to neuroprogeny. So, how does it work? So, it's a virtual reality set. So, guide me through it. Guide me through the steps. If someone's interested and go, okay, I need this device.
Yeah. So what happens is you go ahead and put on a virtual reality headset. And once you've got the headset on, you've got a couple controllers and you just click start. And you'll go into this game and you're sitting right on the edge of a lake, and right next to you is a rock, and there's a campfire set up for you. And so you reach down and you pick up a box of matches and a match, and you actually light the match and you light your fire. And it really invites you into, you are creating the scene together. Or for yourself, and to take care of yourself. And so as you light the fire, then and the game kind of is calibrating, the sun sets, stars come out, and you're sitting over this, watching this lake, and the fire is directly responding to your heart rate variability. So what that means is, if you're resilient, and if you're in a resilient state, then the fire gets bigger, it crackles, it's really nice and vibrant. If you're going into a less resilient state, the fire actually shrinks down and starts smoldering and smoking. And then at the same time, and this is where what we're developed is really novel, is that we're not just training resilience. What we have found is that people can be really resilient in a stress state, and they're not necessarily terribly resilient in a calm state. So what we're also measuring is something called the LFHF ratio. Without getting into the technical piece of it, it's the reliability of how we can shift states. Can I go from a focused state to a relaxed state? If I'm feeling stressed, can I experience that without it consuming me and then shift back to another state? And so what's really fascinating is, for a lot of the high achieving CEOs, and for a lot of the moms, actually, they are really, really good at being resilient in a very high stress state.
Wow.
But as soon as there's the moments of silence, as soon as there's the sitting in calm, as soon as we actually go into a parasympathetic nervous system state, resilience plummets, the fire gets smaller. And so what this allows you to do is, as soon as a thought comes into your mind that, even when it comes down to like, oh, this is exciting, or I'm not doing very well, immediately the fog rolls in, because that maps with the neurochemistry of stress. And so as soon as we have a judgment about our experience, the fog rolls in. And it's so fun, because in the first week or so of using it, people will be like, I don't really know how to control the fog or the fire. It's just observe it. Don't worry about controlling anything. Just sit and watch, and the fog will start rolling out, and people get really excited. And as soon as you get excited about it, the fog rolls in. And so it's all about being able to expand the capacity to sit in uncertainty and trust that you have the capacity within you to respond to whatever is coming, and not to get into this place where you actually have to use a lot of narratives, internal talk, to constantly talk yourself down from stress, or to say, hey, if this thing happens, I've got these 12 backup plans of how I'm going to actually solve it. Because so many of the internal narratives and the scenarios we play out every day, I mean, even the conversations that we're going to have with a coworker or with somebody else, the majority of it never comes to fruition. We're planning hundreds of thousands of conversations. And for what end? And it takes a metabolic toll on us. So being in this environment, as simple as it is, just to see when you have resilience and when you're in a stress state or relaxed state, what happens over time is that the narrative's quiet. And a lot of the folks that I work with, they feel a sense of internal capacity and spaciousness. And, there was a young lady that I was working with that, after about a week and a half, she had a lot of social anxiety and that kind of thing. And she ended up going to a party one weekend. And she texted me after that weekend, and she said, it was the funniest thing. I went to a party, which one I would have never done. And then I forgot to be anxious. And I realized halfway through that it wasn't there. And it was just like, oh, there's this openness. And then another mom that reached out not too long ago, that is holding a lot. Her husband's an entrepreneur and he's always on the go, and she's got a full-time job and managing kids. And she, at the end of the day, was feeling a lot of parental guilt because of this reactivity that would come up. And so she ended up going through the mastermind. And what she realized was one day the girls were starting to argue and fight in the living room. She came out and rather than just kind of going into the explosion of like, okay, who's at fault? You're in trouble, sit in timeout, you do this. She was able to walk into the room and just sit with both of them, bring them both close, co-regulate with them, and actually be able to breathe and relax into it, inviting them into that space. And then the conflict instead turned to laughter and connection. And I mean, how cool is that, to be able to shift from these patterns that we feel powerless to, and we feel like we've got a lot of shame and guilt of like, I just did what I didn't want to do. I want to have connection with my kid, and I just isolated them by yelling at them instead, to actually be able to invite them into the relationship you want to have. And so that's the power of it, even though it's a really simple mechanism. But the other piece around the mechanics of it is that traditional biofeedback is training a breath state. We're not trying to train a breath state.
Right.
What we're actually doing is we're allowing you to see these different aspects of your nervous system in real time, in virtual reality. So it's causing your brain and your body, the virtual reality causes your brain and body to communicate, and actually increases learning by about 400 times over a 2D experience or even real life, which is fascinating. It helps to get us out of old patterns and habits, and then to have the nervous system be able to see itself in real time. And to be able to see your patterns in real time, it actually changes the neurobiology, and it actually increases pathways in our brain and builds new pathways. And the neuroimaging studies we've done on this actually show an increase in brain regulation by 78% in 5 weeks of doing it for 7 to 10 minutes a day. So there's the sustaining change piece of all of that, but it's such a powerful tool. And so really happy to be able to talk about it a little bit.
You just gave me an aha moment there when you said these high functioning people actually find it hard to regulate when they're quiet. And that is massive because, I see so many high functioning men and women, and it's so interesting because I've always sort of questioned like, wow, you're achieving, you're enjoying it. They all say they love the stress, they love the challenges, but of course it's affecting their body in so many ways. And the sitting, doing nothing or stillness is actually quite challenging. So you actually answered a big question for me. Wow, I never really thought about that.
Isn't it fascinating that we really don't have a lot of resilience when we're calm? Just about anything can activate us back out of calm. But then once we're in a stress state, our system says, this is familiar. I can mobilize into this. I have something to focus on and to bring back down. And I developed a nervous system capacity index that's on the website, but it's a free tool that you can look at and take. But it's really interesting because it looks at 12 different domains of life, 14 domains overall, but 12 different areas of parenting, of self-care, of finances, all of these areas of looking at how does your nervous system actually respond to a lot of these things? So there will be these individuals that have these profiles where they're really good at showing up at work and they're 100% regulated. Their nervous system is fully resourced. But then at home or with finances or with personal relationships and connection, where there's just not as many resources available. And it's not necessarily that those areas are weaknesses in the nervous system. They actually just genuinely have a much deeper meaning and a deeper kind of connection within our nervous system that takes a lot more metabolic energy. And if we're already running at a heightened stress state in what's called the allostatic load, where our baseline stress state is already here, but our tolerance for stress is only about that big, just about anything will kick us out of that. And so if parenting is super meaningful to us and we're just showing up and we're overactivated, and so we end up getting frustrated, acting, more reactive with a kiddo, then it's going to shove us outside of that threshold so quickly. And so I think one of the things that's really important is to look at those areas that you're reactive in life aren't necessarily because they're not important or that your nervous system can't handle it. It's actually because there's a ton of meaning and a ton of connection with those areas. And so to give yourself compassion and grace and recognize, let's just build capacity and then bring some of those resources into those areas where you really want to shift your life in a meaningful way.
It makes so much sense because I know listeners know that I've mentioned this before, that I've been on a long journey of trying to relax and having it off. And, in the last 10 years, I've just really worked hard on that. And I suddenly realized my association was growing up. It's like, doing nothing means lazy. You're wasting time. We've got this negative with sitting in stillness. And now I've reframed it. It's taken a long time to reframe it to need nourishment. I need the body to rest. And it's a good thing, body to rest. Beautiful. But I can see how that association would be creating a dysregulation in me of resting.
Absolutely.
And many of my patients may not want to rest because it's creating a bit of a dysregulation. That's so interesting. I want to go back to neuroprogeny because I'm so curious. Sure. Is it for any age group or is it particularly for adults?
That's a great question. So over the years, I've been researching this and using these kind of tools for years, and I've worked a lot with adolescents and that we're in boarding schools and in wilderness therapy programs and in inpatient and outpatient therapeutic environments, and then also working with just families. And I would do brain scans with the entire family, and we'd look at kind of how all their brains were working together. And then we would do some of the virtual reality biofeedback. And it is incredibly effective with kids at pretty much all ages for them to be able to see, because when they are getting frustrated, when they're getting dysregulated, that rather than their parent having to be the mirror and saying like, hey, what's going on here? And they're like, I'm not talking to you, mom and dad, or to the therapist, they can see themselves and they can see, okay, I'm thinking about this topic. And now all of a sudden the fog rolls in. Okay, fine. It might cause some stress for me. It might cause some overactivation. So they can see their own patterns very quickly, take ownership of it. And the cool thing is it drops a lot of the shame and guilt out of it, where it's like, oh, I'm not broken. I am not my behaviors. Oh, my nervous system and my brain were just using those behaviors to get the resources I needed. Cool. So for young folks, it's really useful on that level. And then for the actual community mastermind of what we're doing right now, we're using it primarily for adults 18 and up for the time being, but we also are using the tool, the virtual reality biofeedback tool, with a bunch of clinicians where they're using it in their own office so they can see what's happening in headset on a tablet while they're going through their therapy sessions. And so they can be talking about all kinds of stuff and see, okay, so that actually hit a true emotional chord, rather than, for folks that are really good at being hypercognitive and talking about things over and over again, but not actually mobilizing it to action. This allows you to see, like, actually, let's go deeper. Let's focus in on these things, and helps bring resources so it doesn't feel like there's just something wrong. So to answer your question in a short way, that yes, all age can use it. And so for clinicians that are using it, they're using it with kids all the way up. And then the actual neuroprogeny mastermind is 18 and up.
Because already I'm picturing so many families will benefit, because obviously I see many moms who are struggling with kids on the spectrum. So ADHD, autistic spectrum, and it's that nervous system regulation. Is that something that they can come to you for neuroprogeny, the device?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So whenever we have, for anybody who's experiencing that extra threshold of stress in their life, and that they're constantly having to be on a ton of caretakers. We work with there's a whole cohort of caretakers that they said, it's time. I've got to take care of myself. If I don't, I can no longer sustain this for anybody else. And then the really cool shift that occurs of, I am allowed to take care of myself. I am allowed to do this. And it allows me to feel more connected, more present, and more capable with the folks that I'm caring for. And so with a lot of the folks that we're working with that do have kiddos that have some developmental stuff going on, sensory integration, are on the autism spectrum, that those parents being on 24/7, their nervous system is just worn out. And so, being able to build the capacity back and shift from being embedded in all of that to having more perspective and being able to show up in a different way is really useful.
So definitely the parents, but can the child use it as well?
They can. Yeah. And so there's, So at Sensorium Neuro Wellness, which is the wellness center that I've got here,
Yeah.
we do use it in office with kiddos that are on the spectrum, and we oftentimes will do it in combination with vestibular and proprioceptive therapy, so vibe plate, balance board, being able to do it with red light therapy as well, so that we can use cold laser to target specific areas, and then we also integrate it with the hyperbaric oxygen therapy, and we see massive shifts in emotional regulation, and even going from nonverbal to gaining a lot of words. And so there's some really cool shifts that can occur. And it is one of those core pieces that they can get into, and it actually activates the sensory motor rhythm that is oftentimes one of the culprits of the sensory integration piece. And so by helping to get the brain and body communicating, it quiets down a lot of the sensory noise. So a lot of the stimming behaviors, a lot of the sensory based, like, getting reactive and overactivated, that it can be really useful for that as well.
Amazing. And before I move on to my next question, what about chronic pain?
That's a great question. So virtual reality by itself has had some really cool research behind it of being able to do mild surgery while in virtual reality and not needing anesthesia. And because of the way that it actually directs the salience network. And so the salience network and the default mode networks that's saying, hey, pay attention to, this thing's uncomfortable. So let's hyper focus on it, because hyper focusing on it's going to fix it. And so, which is actually increases the pain receptivity in our pain receptors in our brain, or our pain processing in our brain, and it spikes our fear networks. And so because pain is one of those things that has such close correlations with our fear networks, most pain that we experience is actually the fear component, but our brain isn't interpreting it as fear. It interprets it as pain. And so using virtual reality for that piece of it alone with the biofeedback actually reduces that substantially. It's really powerful, that.
Amazing. Now, I'm really curious. So, you've got so many wearables out there, and people are using so many different types of wearables. Yes, they're collecting data, and especially the HRV. But my question is, what are you doing with that data, right? So HRV, yes, we want to keep that HRV high, but what happens if it's low? Are people, do people actually know what to do? So this is perfect. What you've
going back to that piece that we were talking about, that seeing your HRV is fantastic. And without seeing, okay, what part of your sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system are you in when that HRV is high? Like, it's hard to know what to do with that data. It ends up being a little bit more of a generic score. And don't get me wrong, I am a huge proponent of any wearable that allows you to gain insights and awareness of what's going on in your nervous system, in your life. You can start mapping behaviors and see what the biological outcome is of that. I think it's huge. And I think it's so important for us to gain awareness around that. And I'm a big fan of being as precise as possible, because what we measure, we will change. And so the more precise we can be in what we're measuring and what we're reflecting back to our nervous system, the more we can actually shift and change in a good way.
Amazing. So once people have collected this data, this is a tool they can come to you to actually nervous system regulate. Now, would you ever say it's not instead of psychology or counseling, it's always an adjunct to whatever therapy you're going through? Yeah. Yes. I think that's important.
It's a huge, it's very, very important that, when we look at kind of the interplay, that when our nervous system goes into that oxidative stress state and we're getting those signals of like, hey, there is something that's unsafe, something feels off, we've got a pit in our stomach, we've got tightness in our chest, we've got racing thoughts, whatever it is, our brain is going to go back to some of those core beliefs like we were talking about earlier, those early life schemas of like, who am I supposed to be versus who do I perceive myself to be right now? And that creates a lot of internal conflict, confusion. And so the psychological piece is our mind is constantly projecting a lot of meaning on that. We have to work with that. And that is so important to regulate. And then that as a top-down approach allows our brain to reduce some of the intensity, but then being able to integrate bottom-up approach where we're actually able to connect with our nervous system, our body, and regulate those core pieces that then activate that vagus nerve to calm the brain down and to also bring in that sensory picture we talked about. So the brain no longer has to guess. And if you can pair those two together where you're actually doing that top down and bottom up simultaneously, the research shows that that's when things are most effective for permanent change.
Amazing. Now, this is actually my final question because I think it's so important to go back and work out like the nervous system dysregulation, how it impacts our health. And I think a quick summary from you, because we've already mentioned, pain, that's again, that impact the nervous system, gut symptoms, mental health, fatigue, and how the body's actually looking for safety, and how when it looks for safety, it's very healing because it actually increases immunity, reduces inflammation. And you mentioned something really important, oxidative stress. And I'd love for you to explain for those listeners who are not familiar with that term, oxidative stress as well.
Yeah. So when we're looking at oxidative stress, that is essentially just this continual experience of a slightly elevated sympathetic nervous system tone. So if we look at our balance of our nervous system, we've got the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. They both need to be activated. It's not one or the other. One's not a villain and one's a hero. They both have to be there, and they have to be able to work in concert, kind of like driving and you've got your brake and your gas pedal, that they need to be in coordination. Otherwise, you've got these kind of starts and stops. And so when the sympathetic nervous system is running higher and taking dominance, and that we're in this place then where our body intentionally cuts off from the signals from our body, and it's mobilizing us more towards survival. So our body stays more activated. We're releasing more norepinephrine peptides, so these stress peptides that go down into our cells and prime our cells to respond to stress and adrenaline and that kind of thing. And when we stay there for a long time, it keeps on increasing our baseline stress state of what we expect we should be feeling. And so if you think to yourself, I don't know that I'm that stressed. It's just what I normally experience in life. This is normal to me. That oftentimes is an indication that actually our stress state has just gotten a little bit higher. So when that oxidative stress happens, what it does neurochemically is the norepinephrine starts outweighing something called acetylcholine. They balance each other really well for us to be able to go into rest, digest, and then activate when we need to. And when we burn through that acetylcholine, then our body is no longer communicating safety signals to the brain. And we get caught more in these internal loops and in more of the rumination and overthinking, overprocessing. Then the cascade of biological shift happens. Our body becomes more acidic. Our gut health ends up becoming impacted. That's when we're no longer actually calling on some of the neurotransmitters and some of the processes to actually create the resources we need in order to get our brain back in alignment and in connection. And so that's where we go into slow cellular degradation. Our skin starts kind of showing signs of it. Our hair shows signs of it. Our nails show signs of stress. Everything gets a little more brittle, less healthy. And so that oxidative stress over time also is releasing so much cortisol. It starts impacting our memory. It starts impacting our ability to connect with others. It starts impacting our focus, attention. That's when we're slipping into that brain fog more frequently and really having to actually push through it. And it feels like we're just pushing through molasses to try to just show up to everyday things that are right in front of us. So that's kind of, there's a lot more to it.
Yeah.
But that's a snapshot of kind of how I see it primarily affect.
Amazing. What an incredible conversation. Thank you so much, Cameron, because I've got all these ideas now, which I'm going to start to chat to you after this podcast.
Wonderful.
And
that's great.
Before we leave our listeners, where can people find you?
So the website is immersive.neuroprogeny.com. And then we also have a second website, neuroprogeny.com. And that has a lot of really good resources. And you can certainly check things out there. And then we also have the Instagram and Facebook accounts as well that we're constantly kind of putting some content out on as well. So definitely check us out and ask any questions. And we're always happy to help folks find resources wherever they are. So one of my missions is just to be able to make sure that people have access. And so I'm happy to have conversations and help point people in the right direction.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. It's so good to have this conversation with you.
Thanks for listening to Six Hats, where it's all about progress, not perfection. If this episode spoke to you, don't wait, hit follow now, leave a quick review, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Want to take your next step today? Download my ebook. The link is waiting in the show notes. And remember, this is general advice only. Always speak to your practitioner for anything medical. See you next time.